Welcome to the Dunelm Technology Podcast. Each episode we'll be talking about a different topic to do with technology, and this week we're going to be talking about micro frontends, or MFEs as they're known. I'm Matt Brady, one of the principal engineers at Dunelm, and this week I'm joined by a fellow principal engineer, Warren Fitzpatrick. Hey Warren.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, good thanks. How are you?
I'm wonderful. I'm great. Blessed.
It's a nice sunny day here, so shame to be inside recording, but I think it'd be good to talk about MFEs. Do you want to give a bit of a background about who you are and how you've come to be here talking about MFEs?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, hello. My name's Warren Fitzpatrick. I'm a principal software engineer at Dunelm. I've been enjoying working here for the last 4 years, and mostly within the site experience focus area. I've been working in the tech sphere for the past 20 or so years. And in that time frame, I've worked in multiple sectors like the education, automotive, travel, and retail sector. But most importantly for today, I have an absolute passion for front end development, and I absolutely love talking about micro front ends.
Cool. So I think to get started, then, like, what are micro frontends for people who've never heard that term before? What are we talking about?
Good question. Okay, so micro front ends, in a sentence, it's an architectural style where a web application is divided into smaller, independently deployable parts. And I'll try to bring that to life a little bit for the audience. So if you can imagine dunelm.com on the homepage, it's split into three main sections. So you've got the header at the top, and that's got your links to categories, and you've got the content in the middle. There's things like the call to actions, links, and carousels. And then you've got the footer right at the bottom, which has got a few links. So these are what's known as horizontal slices, and they get their name because they quite literally split a page horizontally. So if you look in a non-MFE architecture, these slices, they're normally co-located in the same code repository, and multiple teams tend to own and work inside of that project. Whereas as if you take a micro front ends architecture, these horizontal slices are actually hosted in completely separate projects, and a single team generally tends to own each one. But going a step further than that, we've also got page groups, and what I mean by that is like your home page, product listing page, basket, checkout, that sort of thing. And these are what's known as vertical slices. So in a non-MFA architecture, these, once again, they're co-located in the same code repository. Multiple teams own and work on a big single project. Whereas as in MFEs, these are, again, completely separate applications that are owned by single teams, and each one works on each one independently. And the final part, I think, that's important to understand about MFEs is that you need to have a system that's clever enough to sort of take those individual parts and stitch them back together. So when a customer comes to visit your website, they get a seamless experience, and they'd be none the wiser. They wouldn't be able to tell what architecture that you're using. So I think from a higher level, that's essentially it.
Okay. So yeah, I guess it's all about the how they're built and deployed, and not really to do with how the customer experiences it.
That's exactly right. Yeah, the customer shouldn't be able to tell the difference. I think, yeah, I'm sure we'll probably get onto some of the benefits, but I think it's more about the environment that you work in, and assuming it's the correct environment, the sort of benefits that you'll get from having that architecture.
Yeah, I guess it's the front end equivalent of microservices in the back end, where you do the same thing and have specific little services doing their job, like the basket microservice, rather than having one big service that's doing everything. But to the person who's consuming that, they might not be aware that it's broken down like that at all.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. It's very, very similar to microservices in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess the next question then is, what's the benefits about going down a micro front end approach compared to sort of just building one big front end application?
Okay, yeah. So there's a few benefits that you get. So I think the biggest one is that MFEs they're easier to maintain, test, and release, as well as reducing your overall risk as well. And I've actually got a really fun analogy that I like to use to explain this when I'm speaking about it. So yeah, I'll have a go at that. Imagine you're changing a light bulb in your house. So you're finished changing the light bulb, and now you want to sort of assert some tests to make sure that the light bulb works. So in a reasonable situation, you might imagine that you'll turn the switch on and off, and actually, if you're being really prudent, you might ensure that the circuit breakers are working as intended. So this kind of situation is kind of like how the tests work in an MFE. Because it's a smaller chunk of the website, you only really need to test and release that chunk and things that are to do with it. So if I apply the same analogy to a monolithic project, you change a light bulb, you verify that the light switch works, you verify that the circuit breakers work as intended, but then you go ahead and test every other light bulb in the house. You check all the taps and toilets to make sure that they're not leaking. You confirm that the boiler heats the house properly. You make sure that the fridge is still cold. You open and close every window and door to verify that they seal correctly. You inspect the house's foundation for cracks. You climb onto the roof and you check for damaged tiles. You verify that the paint is indeed still on your walls and ceilings and that it's the right color. I think you get the picture, right? I have way too much fun with that analogy. Sorry. But yeah, this is kind of how tests work in a monolith, because it doesn't matter how small your change is. Even if you make a tiny change to the homepage, you still need to run tests from every part of the website and deploy every part of the website. And this makes testing and releasing slower, but it actually also makes it a bit more risky as well, because you're physically redeploying the whole website, every single time, rather than just the part that you changed. And I think the thing that makes this especially painful is that even if just one of those tests fail, even if it's completely unrelated to the thing that you changed, you need to run all the tests again and potentially make changes in other areas to, like rectify the failing tests. And so if you can imagine that in a real situation, you can imagine, just how silly that is. But yes, that's why I like the analogy, essentially. But yeah, there are other benefits as well. Parallel development. So, since multiple teams can each own, their own areas, and they can work independently in parallel. So, this effect becomes a lot more valuable with the more teams that you have, and the more areas that you end up migrating across the micro front ends. It effectively increases your throughput. And, just to give some sort of relevant data, we've actually seen this already at Dunelm. So where we've got the product detail page MFE, what we've got with our stats is we've noticed that it's released over twice as often as Dunelm Web. So as we increase the amount of MFEs that we've got, I think we do expect this to be the case for other areas too. So hopefully this will bring our lead time down on front-end tasks, and I see that as a pretty big win. And the only other thing from a higher level is a point about ownership, and probably reduced cognitive complexity along with that. So I think it's important to realise, and I'm sure you'll agree with me on this, Matt, that shared ownership is almost as bad as no ownership, right? And we've seen evidence of that in some of our own services. But with MFEs, you get a clear path for support. So since a single team owns each MFE, you know exactly who to call in times of emergency, which is great for the business. However, it also means that teams are more able to innovate in their space, purely due to the fact that there's less friction and less dependencies between teams. So, just to bring that point to life, if one team makes a release to the product detail page, for instance, that release then won't affect anyone working on the homepage or any other MFEs. And those are probably the main high level benefits, I'd say.
Yeah, I think the analogy of like that you came up with there of like bits of your house that you go around testing, it makes a lot of sense, and it really helps to like visualize where the problem is with that, and why just being able to change a light bulb on its own is good. And to come back to that shared ownership point, we often see these issues where someone releases a change into a sort of monolithic front end, and a test fails, or even worse, it gets released out and there's a incident, something goes wrong on the website, and then because it's shared ownership, and because this change might be unrelated to what went wrong, you have to pull in lots of different people who might not think it's to do with them at all. Like if you come back to the light bulb analogy, maybe the heating stops working, and then you have to bring back the person who changed the light bulb because they were the last one who changed something, and it happened after they did that. So it could be related. It seems unlikely, but it could be. And then you have to bring the people who look after the boiler, and then you have to call the gas company as well. And it's like, it's all very, very confusing. Whereas if you've got these different separate things, they're unlikely to get, all tangled up like that.
That's why I love that analogy. It's the analogy that keeps giving, because you might have called the heating engineer up to figure out that the toilets and sinks and taps don't work, and they're like, oh, I'm not the plumber, you want the plumber. And then you realize it might have been that long that maybe the plumber no longer works here. And it's a silly analogy, but it's kind of highlights the pain that we do see in Dunelm Web currently.
Yeah, yeah. And I imagine there's lots of companies who now have these big front end projects, the same way that we do, because it's most companies have a big customer facing website that's doing the vast majority of what their front end is, because that's what customers have come to expect, that there's a website that they can do everything in. And so companies have had to build these big websites over time, and I guess they start simple usually. Maybe not in the case of like for like retailers like us, maybe not, because you always have the shopping experience, but still they start simpler, and then over time they get more and more complicated, more and more people working on them, expecting more from it. So I imagine a lot of the people that would be looking at the possibility of micro front ends, it wouldn't be to write a new website. It's probably to take their existing website and bring that over to MFEs, which is exactly the situation that we've been in and that you've been leading. So how do people go about that? How do you go from having one big website to these MFEs?
Good question. Yeah, I think you're right about what you say there. It's not necessarily something that you seek from day one. I think you kind of have to grow organically, and more and more teams get added to a project until you start getting these teething issues, and then you might sort of start to look, okay, maybe we can split the sites up into micro front ends. I think the similar is quite true about microservices as well. And thankfully, to sort of answer your question, how do you move over to them? Well, I think carefully and iteratively is the short answer to that. But I think you need a good migration strategy. And the one that we use is quite a well-known one. It's called the strangler migration pattern, and it's not half as violent as it sounds. It actually borrows its name from strangling vines in nature, but it's a well-known architecture pattern for microservices where you move multiple services away from a bigger one. But yeah, I guess to try and bring it to life, if you can imagine, there's a giant old application. Let's just call it the legacy application. So it's this big legacy application. And what you essentially do is you sort of take a small part of it and move it into a new application. Take a small part of it, move it into an application. So over time, this legacy application is always shrinking until eventually it's no more. And then what you'll get at the end of it is your shiny new micro front ends architecture where all the MFEs are on the other side and you're in target architecture. So to give you an idea of exactly how we do that, we've got the ability to target pages based on their URL. So if a customer comes to our website and the URL is for the home page, we can ascertain that with logic on our side, and we can determine, right, okay, this is the home page. Let's send that traffic to MFE, or likewise, let's send that traffic to the legacy website. So it's with this control that we've been able to take a small part of the website, put it into a team, and then basically once they've finished building it, we send traffic to it. So in terms of how you decide on that as well, I can't really talk about maybe the best practice way, but I can tell you what we're doing, and it's working for us, is that we're assessing each area that we have, like the home page, the product detail pages, etc. And what we're doing is we're kind of trying to figure out which one is more valuable. So what would make the biggest impact if we were to rebuild it as an MFE. And we're not just moving things over to MFE. We're also cleaning up as we go. So we're making the website more performant, more accessible, and a lot faster as well. So I think all of this should turn into like increased conversion rates. So, not only are we tackling one area at a time, but we're trying to get a lot of value out of it as well. And that seems to be working for us. And just to shed a bit more information into that process as well. So we actually have a team that helps us with that. So we have our team called the Replatform team. And this team is really important for micro front ends because they're essentially two things for us. They're an enablement team whom we can embed into other teams who pick up micro front end projects, and they can help that team to upskill and just essentially get that project completed. And what they are also is owners of the high level MFE systems. So there are complexities that you introduce with micro front ends, and ownership is a really, really important thing, which is why I sort of touched on it earlier. But I think equally with these other services that you require, you also require ownership of those. So it's very important to do that, and that's another part of this. But the way I like to think about it is that you put one brick in at a time until eventually you have a wall. It's essentially like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that way it's not risky. Each time you do something, you lower the risk. If you try to change it all at once, it'd be a huge project. And then the day you try and switch it over, you'd find hundreds of issues probably, and then be in a bad situation. So yeah, that's a good way of avoiding the risk.
That's it. And actually, it goes another way to reducing risk as well, because it's a separate application. We've got the old application intact, but let's say that we've rebuilt the homepage. We've got this brand new homepage waiting next to the legacy application. And because we can, do that targeting thing that I mentioned, where that the request is for the homepage, so you can send traffic to it. If something were to go wrong, it's a really, really quick change for us to say, okay, stop sending traffic there. And then we make the fixes and then we send it across. So I think like the Strangler migration pattern for us is working wonders, and it really, really does reduce that risk. And the iterative approach also helps.
Yeah, and I suppose you can also do some experimentation there to say, once you've got that new area, that you could just send 10% of people, 50% of people to the new version and keep everyone else on the old one, and just make sure that it's all working and performing nicely before you move everyone across. Is that something that you've tried?
That's essentially it, yeah. So I think we normally start with 1% and we just have a look at our Datadog dashboards and things like that. So we keep a track on metrics like core web vitals, error rates, and stuff like that. So assuming that 1% isn't turning up more errors than we expect, we might up that to 10%. And then we track things all the way through the funnel. So we're literally looking at things like exit rate, conversion rate, add to basket rate, and what sort of revenue that we're getting at the end of it. So I think the idea is that when we start sending traffic to 50%, that's where we like to stay there for about a week. And what this gives you is it gives you like a really good sort of 50-50 comparison, and you can actually really draw a line to see what are the effects this MFE are having on it. And I know that the SRP is something that actually released today, funnily enough, to 100%, and we've noticed that there's been a small conversion increase. We saw the same thing with PDP as well. So yeah, it's absolutely the right way to do it, and it's something that we use to really, really measure the impact, and it tells a story effectively.
Yeah, it's interesting that we've seen, because I think when we first talked about MFEs earlier on, we were saying that to a user they wouldn't know whether or not they're on an MFE or not, but we're seeing increased or better performance stats and things like that. So I guess there are things you can do, like there are benefits under the hood that the user might not know it's because of MFE. They just might know things are performing better than they could, or better than they did before.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess the clear distinction to make there is it's not necessarily an MFE specific thing, but it's because we've had the opportunity to rebuild something. And I think, hindsight's always 2020, right? If you build something once, chances are if you build it again, you're going to know how to do it a lot better and not fall into those pitfalls. And I think that's really what we owe the speed and the sort of performance benefits to, is that we know where we went wrong the first time, and we know how to improve it. So the second time you build it is always better. But yeah, that's essentially it. The customers are going to get that better experience the second time around.
Yeah, and I suppose because you're building smaller chunks, you don't need to support as much. You know, you couldn't take an existing monolithic web app and easily speed it up because there's areas of the sites that might need X, Y, and Z, features. They might need every page load to pull in a certain JavaScript file or something just in case the user goes to that part of the website. Whereas if you know you're on an MFE, you don't have any of that. It's a bit like the monolithic version is a bit like the Homer car from The Simpsons, that it sort of can do everything, but it means it's carrying a lot of baggage with it. Whereas your MFE can be a bit more of a sports car that's targeted to just what you need.
Exactly. And that's one of my favorite things, that's one of my favorite things about MFEs is because a single team owns it and they're essentially able to work on it independently. There's nothing stopping them from trying new things and innovating in that space. If they were to do that in a monolith, it might break a lot of things downstream. It might have an effect or an impact on what other teams are doing. But in this environment, the teams are really, really free to innovate in those spaces. Like if they wanted to introduce a new piece of technology, there's absolutely nothing stopping them from doing that. But the best part is if they do introduce a new bit of technology, it then doesn't affect anybody else, which is great. I hope to see that innovation piece really, really come to life once we've got a few more MFEs out there and a few more teams, working on them.
Yeah, and I guess that there's an interesting point or attention here because, as you say, one of the benefits of MFEs is that you free up your teams, and in theory they could be writing in completely different front end languages, if they wanted to. But I suppose at the end of the day, you still need the experience to the customer to be seamless and to all work together nicely. Um, so how do you help to make sure that you strike that right balance between the freedom of the teams but keeping it all consistent and integrated?
That is a good point. So this is what we've tried to do with the replatform team. Fortunately, I've been in touch with a guy called Luca Mezzalera, who's like the author of Micro Frontends book from AWS, and yeah, what he says in there is it's so clear that you need guardrails and guides, and you absolutely need that enablement team to own things straight away. So we've put a lot of thought and planning into what parts that we actually want to be shared, what parts that we want to be standardized, and try to sort of balance that with how much control that a team has over their repo. So this is another thing about micro front ends that's, it's got a lot of benefits, but at the same time it introduces lots of challenges as well. And I think you've just, stumbled onto one of them there. But you shouldn't share too many things with micro front ends. They do need to sort of stay independent enough so that if you change something somewhere else, it doesn't have an effect on someone else's MFEs. So I think that's the part that really gives the team the freedoms. But at the same time, where do you draw that line, right? So that's where we've got the replatform team sort of in there right from the very start of a project, and we're asking all these questions, discovering the projects and all that, and really just sort of feeding into it. And I can't say we have all the answers straight away, but it's something that we're on a process with. And as we pick up each new area, we're sort of figuring out and finding out more. But the good thing is because the replatform's involved with all of them, they can then feed into the bigger picture, and everyone gets that sort of standardized experience. So yeah, it's a journey, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I mean, we've talked on a few of the challenges, I guess. So when would you say an MFE wouldn't be the right choice?
So this is a great question. I don't think this gets asked enough, to be honest, because the first thing to know about MFEs is that they're absolutely not a silver bullet. There are certain situations where they're good, and there's certain situations where they're really not good. So I guess a really simple example is if you had a really, really basic project and you had one team working on it, there's really not much point implementing MFEs in that situation. And I guess you could probably summarize it this way. I think MFEs they're very complicated to set up initially, and they require a huge amount of planning, extra systems as well. In order to get them to take multiple parts and stitch them together. So yeah, they're great in some respects, but they also introduce a rather unique set of challenges when it comes to stitching your projects back together, and also with things like UI consistency, testing, orchestration. So I think simply put, MFEs are a lot of effort to implement. So if the benefits are outweighed by the costs, then that's when you shouldn't do it. So I think to give a good example of when it is appropriate, just to sort of round that question off, is when you have a really large company with a really large engineering team. So I mean, just to give an example of some statistics here, we have 11 different teams that work on our website at any one time. And the thing is as you get more and more teams, it becomes impossible for 11 teams to stay abreast of what every single other team are doing. So I think as that scale really increases, the chances are that micro front ends are going to be a better option for you increase as well. So I think that's probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, it's always the case with these any kind of technology that it's not always a silver bullet. There's things that are newer and shinier, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be the right choice for everyone. So I think yeah, you've got to make sure you've got that that reason, and that's why I imagine a lot of the good candidates are more likely like legacy websites that are being rewritten rather than things being created from scratch. Because usually when you're starting something, you start it with a small team who focus on it, and I guess there's a lot of business benefit you can get just from building a monolithic site before the overhead of splitting it into MFEs justifies itself.
Exactly right. I think the only chance you'd probably reach for it off the shelf is if you've got really, really clearly defined domains. You know that you have like a lot of teams that work on these things. So, I mean, just to give an example for Dunelm, we know that we've got payments as a section that could be its own thing, right? So you could have one team that could work on the back end systems because we have microservices, but likewise they could work on the front end system as well. They could literally own the checkout section of the site and all the services that control it. And I really like the idea of having teams that own the complete vertical slice. And I think MFE really opens up the door to that. But if you haven't got that, then yeah, you just need to think really, really hard. Is it going to be worth the effort, essentially?
Yeah. I think it helps with the ownership of that because it's something that we've seen that when a lot of people own something, then really nobody owns that thing because it's hard for if they say you got 11 teams working on it, if there's some package that needs to be updated, which of the 11 teams does it? Whereas if it's a front end that's owned by one team, it's clear who's going to do it in that case. And I think that's another sort of benefit to doing that, and having that, as you say, with that vertical integration. Then it means that if they're working on delivering something, there's no other team that's going to get in their way or a change in the system that's going to block them from doing what they need to because they own the whole journey, which is really really neat.
It's all about independence. If you can reduce all of your dependencies, teams can work independently, then the world's a better place, essentially. You'll be able to get work out really, really quickly, really efficiently. People will start to really enjoy what they're doing. People are going to be innovating in their spaces. And because the innovation is happening, customers are going to be benefiting at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I just wanted to sort of to bring it back a little bit. We talked about one of the benefits being that you don't have to test the whole house when you release. Is there any advice on, you do need to make sure that the whole house still works. How's best to go about that? Like that sounds like a quite a challenge when we're deploying like this.
Yeah, it definitely is a challenge, and it's something that we've spent quite a while looking into. So unfortunately, I might have to speak a bit technically now about some of these concepts, but the notion of contract testing is something that's come up before, where you might have a contract that exists. So for instance, if you add something to the basket in the content, the header might also need to know about that. But equally, if you add something to the basket on a PDP, the checkout might also need to know about that. So you've got these contracts between pages, but unfortunately, we've looked at things like packed testing and stuff like that, but it just doesn't really lend itself well to a front end architecture. So we've actually opted for something that's a lot more simple. And whether or not it's effective is something that, we'll see if it stands the test of time or not. But what we've decided to do is just carefully document what these contracts are, and then we put a test in at the boundary. So what that means is you might decide to write a test on the product detail page, for instance. If you've added something to the basket, you made sure that it was definitely added in a certain way. And then there's like a manual process above that, because you are aware of these carefully documented contracts between areas, that in the basket, if anything changes, you're keeping people informed, or you're updating your tests at either end. So we're trying to respect these boundaries. But at the end of the day, I think it is something we need to be really, really careful of. So by default, it's something that we actively try to avoid putting in as well. So keep them to a minimum, but when they do appear, document them clearly, make sure somewhere has a test that covers it, and keep the sort of lines of communication open between the teams that own them. So it's a bit of a process at the moment, and I suppose as we add more and more MFEs, we'll have to see if that's effective or if we need to pivot.
Yeah, that's really good, really good. So I think we've covered quite a bit. Is there any if people are interested in learning more about MFEs, is there anything you'd recommend for them to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Luca Mezzalera, the guy I mentioned earlier, he's absolute fountain of knowledge for this. He's actually got his own YouTube channel as well called My 50 Cents. So yeah, I mean, maybe just type Luca Mezzalera into YouTube, and there's a whole plethora and library of knowledge in there. And yeah, I really respect the man, and I've learned a lot from him personally. So definitely a good place to start.
Yeah, perfect. We'll put the links to his stuff in the description. And I think you've also done a few videos and podcasts specifically about Dunelm's journey, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I took part in something for AWS for every application. So I was a panelist on that, which involved going into AWS's London office and going into one of their recording studios, which was a really, really cool experience that I won't soon forget. So yeah, that's on AWS for every application website. I think you can sort of go there and look for some micro front end stuff. And actually, shameless plug, Luca Mezzalera's YouTube channel, I've also appeared as a speaker on there as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Warren. It's been great talking about MFEs with you. And as I said, we'll put down in the description some of those things that we've just talked about. But yeah, thank you for joining us on an episode of the Dunelm Technology Podcast, and we'll be back soon with another episode.